The moving truck pulled away from the curb, leaving behind cardboard boxes stacked in the garage and a sense of new beginnings. James Wilson stood in the driveway of his new home, taking in the neat rows of houses with their perfect lawns and trimmed hedges. After 15 years serving his country in the military's most elite units, he finally had a place to call home. "What do you think?" he asked his wife Diane, who joined him outside, wiping her hands on her jeans. "It's beautiful," she said, looking up at the two-story colonial with its fresh paint and wide windows. "I still can't believe it's ours." Their son Tyler jogged out of the house, basketball in hand. At 16, he was already as tall as his father, with the same thoughtful eyes and athletic build. "Dad, there's a court at the end of the street. Can I check it out?" James nodded, watching as his son bounded down the sidewalk, dribbling the ball with practiced ease. Their daughter Mia followed shortly after, her tablet in hand, looking for the best spot to get Wi-Fi in the yard. Oak Ridge Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the promise James had held on to during long nights in foreign countries, during missions he couldn't talk about, during moments when home seemed like a distant dream. The community had everything they wanted: good schools, safe streets, a sense of order that appealed to James's military background. What he didn't know yet was that order came at a price. "Honey, I think we're being watched," Diane whispered later that evening as they unpacked the kitchen. She nodded toward the window where a man stood across the street, not even pretending not to stare at their house. James glanced outside. The man was in his 60s with the rigid posture of someone who once wore a uniform. He had a small notebook in his hand and appeared to be writing something down. "Probably just curious about the new neighbors," James said, though his instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through 3 war zones, were quietly humming. "I'll go introduce myself tomorrow." That night, as the family sat around pizza boxes in their empty dining room, Tyler mentioned the basketball court. "It's nice, but some old guy came by and asked a bunch of questions about who I was and where we moved from." James paused mid-bite. "What did he want to know?" "If we're renting or buying, if I had proper permission to use the court, weird stuff like that." Tyler shrugged. "I told him my dad was military and we just bought the house. He seemed less friendly after that." "I met some girls my age," Mia chimed in, "but their mom pulled them away when they were showing me their dog. She said they needed to get home for dinner, but it was only 4 o'clock. James and Diane exchanged glances. They'd moved enough times to recognize the signs of a community that might not be as welcoming as the brochure suggested. The next morning, James went for his usual 5-mile run, a habit from his military days that helped him think. As he jogged through the neighborhood, he noticed details his training had taught him to spot: which houses had security cameras, which residents watched him pass with curiosity versus suspicion, which cars slowed down as they drove by him. When he returned home, the same man from yesterday was standing near their mailbox, this time wearing a polo shirt with what looked like a badge pinned to it. As James approached, he could see it wasn't an official police badge, but rather something that said, "Oak Ridge Security." "Good morning," James said, slowing to a walk, his breathing barely affected by the run. "I'm James Wilson. We just moved in." The man straightened, clearly trying to match James's height and failing. "Howard Baxter. I'm head of neighborhood security. We like to keep track of who comes and goes around here." James nodded, noting the man's choice of words. "Well, we're not going anywhere. Just bought the place." Howard's eyes narrowed slightly. "You military?" "Yes, sir. Special Forces. Retired now." Something flickered across Howard's face. Surprise, maybe even disappointment. "Well, there are rules here. Strict ones. The HOA doesn't tolerate noise, unauthorized gatherings, or any activities that might disturb the peace." James kept his expression neutral, though he felt a familiar tension building at the base of his neck. He'd dealt with men like Howard before, people who mistook authority for power, who defined peace as control. "I appreciate the heads up," James said evenly. "We're a quiet family, just looking for a good place to raise our kids." Howard glanced toward the house where Tyler was helping Diane unload groceries from their car. See that you remember the rules. We take violations very seriously here." As Howard walked away, James noticed the slight bulge at his hip, poorly concealed by his untucked shirt. The man was carrying a firearm, legal with a permit, but an unusual choice for checking the mail on a sunny morning in a gated community. Over the next few days, the Wilsons settled into a routine. Diane set up her home office. The kids started at their new schools, and James began consulting work with a private security firm. They met a few neighbors, some friendly, others politely distant. The family across the street brought over cookies while the elderly woman next door offered gardening tips. But Howard Baxter and his small group of self-appointed security volunteers seemed to be everywhere. They drove slowly past the house, multiple times a day. When Tyler shot hoops in the driveway, someone was always watching. When Mia rode her bike around the cul-de-sac, a car would idle nearby. "It's like living in a fishbowl," Diane said one night as they sat on their back patio, enjoying a rare moment alone. "Did you see how they were taking photos of our fence today? Apparently it's 2 inches higher than regulation." James sipped his iced tea, thinking, "It's not the fence they're concerned about." "I know," she replied quietly. "We're the first black family on this block, maybe in the whole community." James had faced prejudice before, both in and out of uniform, but he'd hoped things would be different here, in this upscale neighborhood where education and affluence should have overcome such biases. "Give it time," he said, squeezing her hand. "People adjust." What he didn't say was that some people never adjust. And what Howard Baxter didn't know was that James Wilson wasn't just any military veteran. Years of specialized training had taught him to read situations, to anticipate threats, and to always have a plan. So when Howard began following Tyler home from the bus stop, when the security patrols increased to hourly drive-bys, when anonymous complaints about their lawn height and garbage can placement started arriving from the HOA, James didn't get angry. He got ready. He installed security cameras, documenting every interaction. He researched HOA bylaws, finding the limits of their actual power. He made connections with the genuinely friendly neighbors, building allies, and most importantly, he kept his family safe while teaching them strength. "Remember," he told Tyler, one evening after a particularly tense encounter with Howard at the community mailboxes, "we belong here as much as anyone. We earned this home. We will not be intimidated, but we also won't give anyone an excuse." Tyler nodded, his young face serious. "I know, Dad." What James didn't tell his son was that he always carried his licensed firearm now, concealed professionally as only someone with his training could manage. He didn't mention that he'd mapped every exit route from their neighborhood, or that he kept his go bag ready. Old habits from dangerous places. He hoped they wouldn't be necessary in this quiet suburb. But as Howard Baxter's car crept past their house for the third time that day, James knew that peace wasn't guaranteed, even in paradise, and he was prepared for whatever came next. 2 weeks after moving into Oak Ridge Estates, things seemed to settle into an uneasy routine for the Wilson family. James had returned to his consulting work, Diane was organizing her home office, and the kids were making friends at their new schools despite the watchful eyes that still followed them around the neighborhood. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. The kind of perfect spring day that made even Howard Baxter's daily drive-bys seem less threatening. Tyler had mentioned wanting to invite some friends over, and James had agreed, seeing it as a normal part of helping his son adjust to their new home. "Just keep the noise reasonable," James told his son over breakfast. "And stay in the front yard or the house where I can see you." Tyler nodded, already texting his friends. "They'll be here around noon. We just want to play some ball." By midday, the driveway basketball hoop that James had installed earlier that week had drawn quite a crowd. 4 teenage boys were playing 2-on-2, their laughter and good-natured trash talk filling the quiet street. Tyler's new friends were a diverse group. Anthony was tall and lanky with dark hair, Miguel had moved from Puerto Rico the previous year, and Kevin lived 3 houses down. They rotated players after each game, everyone getting a chance to play. Diane brought out cold drinks and watched from the porch, smiling at how quickly Tyler had found his place. "It's good to see him happy," she said when James joined her. "Yeah, It is. But James's attention was divided. He'd noticed a now familiar SUV making its third pass of the house since the boys had started playing. Howard Baxter was watching, and he wasn't being subtle about it. On the fourth pass, Howard slowed to a crawl, rolling down his window to take photos with his phone. The boys noticed but kept playing, though their voices dropped a bit. "Should I say something?" Diane asked, her smile fading. James shook his head. "Not yet. Let's see what he does." What Howard did was park at the end of the street and make a call. Within minutes, another car pulled up beside his, a white sedan with Oak Ridge Estate security magnetically attached to the door. A woman, James recognized from the HOA board, stepped out and spoke with Howard, both of them looking toward the Wilson house. "I'm going inside to get more drinks," James said to Diane, his voice calm despite the tension building in his shoulders. "Keep an eye on things." Inside, he moved to the window in his home office that gave him a clear view of both the driveway and the street beyond. Years of training had taught him to monitor situations without being seen, to assess threats before engaging. Right now, his instincts were humming that familiar warning tone. In the driveway, the game continued. Tyler stole the ball from Kevin and made a perfect layup, his friends cheering. The sound of normal teenage life, exactly what James had wanted for his family. Then Howard and the HOA board member began walking toward the house, purpose in their stride. James watched as Howard adjusted something under his untucked shirt, checking his concealed weapon. A cold feeling settled in James's gut. He moved quickly to the closet, unlocked his gun safe, and secured his own licensed firearm in a holster at the small of his back, concealed by his light jacket. He hoped he was overreacting, but 15 years in special forces had taught him to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. By the time James stepped back outside, Howard and the woman, whose name tag read Patricia, were standing at the edge of the driveway. The boys had paused their game, the basketball held loosely in Miguel's hands. "Afternoon," James said pleasantly, walking down from the porch. "Can I help you folks with something?" Patricia cleared her throat. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Patricia Green, from the HOA board. We've received multiple noise complaints about this gathering." James looked at the 4 teenagers, then back at Patricia with a raised eyebrow. 4 kids playing basketball on a Saturday afternoon? The covenant clearly states that all social gatherings must be approved by the HOA with at least 48 hours' notice, Howard cut in, his hand resting near his hip. "And there are strict noise limitations even during daylight hours." Tyler stepped forward, always respectful but clearly confused. "We're just playing ball, sir. We're not being that loud." Howard's eyes narrowed at Tyler. "You boys need to disperse. Now, this is an unauthorized gathering." "On my private property?" James asked, his voice still pleasant but with an edge that made Howard's eyes flick toward him. "The driveway falls under HOA jurisdiction," Patricia said, though she sounded less certain now. James noticed how Howard was positioning himself, angling to keep both James and the boys in his sight line, his right hand never straying far from his hip. Classic intimidation stance. James had seen it used on civilians in war zones. It had no place here in a peaceful neighborhood aimed at children. "Let me see the specific bylaw," James said, directing his words to Patricia while keeping Howard in his peripheral vision. "I've read the covenant thoroughly and don't recall any requirement for approval of 4 kids playing basketball." Howard took a step closer to the boys. "I don't need to show you anything. As head of security—" "Self-appointed head of security," James corrected mildly. "Oak Ridge Estates doesn't have an official security force. Just volunteers like yourself." The tension in the air thickened. The boys sensed it, looking nervously. Between the adults, Miguel placed the basketball on the ground, a universal signal of non-threat that broke James's heart to witness from a teenager in his own driveway. "Dad?" Tyler's voice carried a question. "It's okay, son," James said, never, taking his eyes off Howard. "Why don't you and your friends go inside and get something to drink? Mrs. Wilson can show you where the sodas are." Diane, who had been watching from the porch, understood immediately. "Boys, come on in. I've got pizza rolls in the oven too." Howard stepped forward as if to block their path. "Nobody's going anywhere. Until we sort this out. The boys are going inside my house, James said, each word precise and measured. Unless you have a warrant or legal authority, you cannot prevent them from doing so. Patricia touched Howard's arm. He's right, Howard. We can discuss the noise complaint without detaining minors. But Howard had locked eyes with Tyler, who stood his ground with the quiet dignity James had always taught him. These kinds of gatherings always lead to trouble, Howard said. I've seen it before. First it's basketball, then it's music, then it's... Careful about your next words, James interrupted, his voice finally losing its pleasant tone. Those are children you're talking about. My son and his friends. Howard's face reddened. I know exactly what they are. The statement hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. James saw Tyler's shoulders tense, saw the hurt flash across his son's face before being carefully hidden. In that moment, something shifted in James. The professional calm he'd maintained cracked, revealing the protective father beneath. Boys inside, now, James said, his voice leaving no room for argument. As the teenagers moved toward the house, Howard made a critical mistake. He reached for his concealed weapon, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps as an instinctive response to losing control of the situation, but his hand never made it to his hip. James was suddenly beside him, moving with the fluid speed that only comes from thousands of hours of training. His hand closed firmly around Howard's wrist, applying precisely enough pressure to stop the movement without causing injury. Don't, James said quietly, so only Howard could hear him. Whatever you're thinking right now, whatever you've convinced yourself is happening here, stop. Those are children walking away from you, my son and his friends. If your hand gets any closer to that gun, we will have a problem that neither of us wants. Howard's eyes widened as he realized two things simultaneously. James knew about his concealed weapon, and James was far more dangerous than he had assumed. Are we clear? James asked, still quiet, still controlled. Howard nodded stiffly, and James released his wrist. I suggest you both leave now, James said to Howard and Patricia. If there's an actual HOA rule being broken, feel free to send it in writing. Otherwise, this conversation is over. As they walked away, James watched them go, his heart racing despite his outward calm. Inside the house, his son was waiting, and James knew the conversation they needed to have would be one of the hardest of his life. Explaining a reality he'd hoped Tyler wouldn't have to face so soon. At least not here. Not in what was supposed to be their sanctuary. But that was a problem for later. Right now, he needed to make sure Howard Baxter understood exactly who he was dealing with, before things escalated to a point where no one could turn back. The Sunday morning following the basketball confrontation was unusually quiet on Maple Lane. James woke early, as he always did. Old habits from military life were hard to break. He made coffee and sat on the back patio, listening to birds and thinking about yesterday's events. Diane joined him, still in her pajamas, hair wrapped in a colorful scarf. You're thinking too loud, she said, taking the cup he offered. Howard isn't going to let this go, James replied, his eyes scanning the backyard perimeter, another habit he couldn't shake. Yesterday was just the beginning. Diane sighed. I thought we were past this kind of thing. We picked this neighborhood because it seemed so normal. Normal is different depending on who you are, James said. He'd tried to explain this to his children over dinner last night, how some people see threats where none exist, how fear can make ordinary things seem dangerous. Tyler had listened quietly, then asked the question James had been dreading. It's because we're black, isn't it? The simple truth of it had hung in the air. James didn't believe in lying to his children or sugarcoating reality. Yes, for some people that's enough to make them afraid. Now, in the morning light, James wondered if he'd done the right thing by bringing his family here. The house was perfect, the schools were excellent, but none of that mattered if they weren't safe or welcome. His phone buzzed with a text message from a neighbor, Lee Chen, who lived across the street. Emergency HOA meeting called for 2 p.m. today. Topic: security concerns and gathering restrictions. Thought you should know. James showed the message to Diane. "They're moving fast." "What do we do?" she asked. "We go to the meeting," James said. "We let them see us as people, not problems." By 1:45 that afternoon, the Wilsons were walking toward the community center. Tyler had wanted to come and James hadn't objected. At 16, he was old enough to see how these things worked, to learn how to handle them with dignity. The parking lot was full. Apparently, security concerns brought out the neighbors. As they approached the entrance, James saw Howard standing near the door with Patricia and two other men he recognized from previous HOA events. They were talking intensely, but fell silent when they spotted the Wilsons. "Didn't expect to see you here," Howard said, his tone suggesting they weren't welcome. "We're homeowners," James replied simply. "This is an HOA meeting." Inside, the community room was already crowded. Chairs had been arranged in rows facing a small stage where the HOA board members sat at a table. James noticed how conversations quieted as they entered, how eyes followed them as they found seats near the back. Patricia called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As many of you know, there have been some incidents that have raised concerns about neighborhood security and our gathering policies." James felt eyes turning toward them. He kept his expression neutral, a skill learned during tense negotiations in far more dangerous places than this suburban community center. "Before we discuss specific policy changes," Patricia continued, "Howard Baxter has some information he'd like to share about recent security concerns." Howard stood and walked to the front, adjusting his polo shirt with its unofficial security badge. "As many of you know, I've been volunteering as head of community security for the past 5 years. In that time, we've maintained a safe, peaceful neighborhood." He glanced pointedly at the Wilsons. "Recently, we've had some new residents who seem unfamiliar with our community standards. Yesterday, I had to break up an unauthorized gathering that was causing a disturbance." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "What kind of gathering?" "A group of teenage boys playing basketball in a driveway," James said clearly from the back, not waiting to be called on. "My son and 3 friends." Murmurs spread through the room. James could see confusion on some faces. 4 teenagers playing basketball was hardly a security threat. Howard's face reddened. "It was more than that. They were being loud, and we've had complaints from several residents." "Who complained?" asked an elderly man near the front. "My house is 2 doors down, and I didn't hear anything unusual." Howard hesitated. "The complaints were confidential." James watched as people exchanged glances. He could feel the mood of the room shifting. This wasn't going the way Howard had planned. "If I may," James said, standing up. Every eye in the room turned to him. "My name is James Wilson. My family moved here 3 weeks ago because we believed this community shared our values: safety, education, family. Yesterday, my son invited 3 friends to play basketball in our driveway. Mr. Baxter approached them with accusations about noise and unauthorized gatherings. He made them feel unwelcome and threatened." Howard stepped forward. "That's not what happened. They were defiant and refused to disperse when asked." "They were children playing basketball," James replied evenly. "On private property. My property." A woman James didn't recognize stood up. "I drive past your house on my way home from work. I saw those boys yesterday. They weren't causing any trouble. They were just playing." Another neighbor nodded. "My son knows Tyler from school. He's a good kid." Howard's face darkened. "You don't understand. This is how it starts. First basketball, then parties, then who knows what else. Property values will fall. Crime will increase." The room went very quiet. What Howard was implying was suddenly clear to everyone. James took a deep breath. "Mr. Baxter, if you have specific concerns about my family's behavior, please state them clearly. If not, I suggest we focus on actual security issues, not assumptions based on—" He paused. "Not biases." Howard's hand moved slightly toward his hip, the same unconscious gesture from yesterday. "I've worked in law enforcement. I know trouble when I see it." "Dad," Tyler whispered, noticing the movement. James had seen it too. He placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder while keeping his eyes on Howard. "Mr. Baxter, are you armed? Right now? At a community meeting?" Howard straightened. "I have a legal permit to carry." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Patricia stood up, clearly alarmed. "Howard, we've discussed this. Weapons are not permitted at HOA functions." "I'm security," Howard insisted. "I need to be prepared." "For what?" James asked quietly. 4 teenagers playing basketball? A family attending a community meeting? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. James could see Howard's control slipping, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, as his neighbors looked at him with new uncertainty. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting. "Let's take a short break and—" "No," Howard snapped. "We need to vote on the new restrictions now. We need stricter controls on gatherings, more security patrols." His voice was rising. "We need to protect what we've built here." James watched. Howard carefully, recognizing the signs of someone about to make a critical error. His training kicked in, mentally mapping the room, noting exits, calculating distances, identifying potential threats. But this wasn't a combat zone. It was a community meeting in a suburb. The only real threat was a man whose worldview was crumbling in real time. "Mr. Baxter," James said, his voice calm but carrying authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. "I think we all want the same thing, a safe, peaceful community. But safety doesn't come from restrictions and patrols. It comes from knowing and trusting your neighbors." Several people nodded in agreement. An older woman near the front spoke up. "I've lived here for 30 years. We've never needed armed security. This isn't what Oak Ridge is about." Howard looked around the room, seeing support slipping away. His hand moved again, this time more deliberately toward his concealed weapon. "You don't understand the threats—" "Howard!" Patricia's voice cut through sharply. "Remove your hand from your weapon immediately or I'm calling the police." The room went still. Everyone was suddenly aware of how dangerous the situation had become. Parents pulled children closer. Elderly residents looked fearful. And Howard stood isolated at the front, his hand frozen mid-movement. James moved Tyler behind him with a subtle gesture. "Everyone stay calm," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Mr. Baxter is going to make the right choice here." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Howard seemed to waver between two paths. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand. "This meeting is adjourned," Patricia announced, her voice shaking slightly. "Howard, I need your security badge, now. What happened next would change everything." The community center emptied quickly after Patricia ended the meeting. Parents hurried children to cars, neighbors clustered in worried groups, and board members huddled near the stage, speaking in urgent whispers. Howard stood alone at the front, his face a mix of anger and disbelief as Patricia held out her hand for his badge. "This is ridiculous," Howard said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've protected this community for years, and this is how you thank me?" James kept his family close as they moved toward the exit. He caught Patricia's eye and gave her a small nod of appreciation. She had made the right call, and it couldn't have been easy. "Dad, can we go home now?" Tyler asked quietly. "Soon," James replied, watching Howard carefully. Men like him were most dangerous when cornered, when their authority was challenged publicly. "Let's just wait a minute." Howard finally unpinned the badge from his shirt and slapped it into Patricia's palm. "You'll regret this," he said, then turned and stormed toward the exit, directly toward where the Wilson family stood. James positioned himself slightly in front of Diane and Tyler. As Howard approached, James could see the man's eyes were unfocused, his breathing uneven. Classic signs of someone not thinking clearly. "This is your fault," Howard said, stopping inches from James. "You think you can just move in here and change everything?" "No one's changing anything," James replied calmly. "We just want to live in peace, like everyone else." Howard's laugh was harsh. "Peace? You people don't even know the meaning of the word. I've worked with your kind before." Several neighbors who had lingered nearby gasped. Patricia hurried over. "Howard, that's enough. Go home and cool off." But Howard wasn't listening. His hand drifted again toward his hip, a movement that was becoming alarmingly familiar. James saw it and made a split-second decision. "Tyler, take your mother outside," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But Dad—" "Now, son." Diane understood immediately, guiding Tyler toward the door despite his reluctance. Other neighbors backed away too, sensing the growing tension. Howard watched them leave, then turned back to James. "Running away? Smart move." "No one's running," James said. "I just want my family safe while we finish our conversation." "There's nothing to talk about," Howard snapped. "You don't belong here." Patricia tried again to intervene. "Howard, please leave before this gets worse." Howard ignored her, his focus entirely on James. "I know your type. Military background doesn't make you special. I was law enforcement for 20 years. I know trouble when I see it." James remained steady, his expression neutral. "There's no trouble here unless you create it." "Is that a threat?" Howard's hand moved more deliberately now, his jacket shifting to reveal the holster beneath. James noticed several people had phones out, recording the confrontation. Good. Witnesses were important. But he needed to end this before it escalated further. "Mr. Baxter," James said, deliberately using the formal address. "You're upset and not thinking clearly. Why don't we both walk outside, get some fresh air, and talk this through like neighbors?" Howard's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't see what you're doing? Trying to get me alone? Not happening." "Then let's talk right here," James offered. "In front of everyone. Tell me what's really bothering you about my family living here." The question hung in the air. Howard seemed caught off guard by the directness. Several people watched intently, waiting for his answer. "You're a security risk," Howard finally said, though his voice had lost some of its conviction. "How?" James pressed gently. "Be specific." Howard struggled visibly, his anger colliding with the sudden realization that he couldn't articulate his concerns without revealing their true nature. "The basketball game was too loud," he finally managed. An older woman nearby shook her head. "Oh, come on, Howard. My grandkids make more noise than those boys did." "It's not just about noise," Howard insisted, growing more agitated. "It's about respect for rules, for authority." "Whose authority?" James asked quietly. "You're not law enforcement anymore, Mr. Baxter. And until today, you were a volunteer security coordinator for a homeowners association. That's not a position of legal authority." Something changed in Howard's expression then. A hardening, a decision made. "You think you know everything because you were military? Special forces doesn't mean anything in my neighborhood." James noticed. The shift from the neighborhood to my neighborhood, a telling slip. "This community belongs to everyone who lives here," he said, "including my family." Howard's hand moved again, this time with clear purpose, reaching for his concealed weapon. Several people shouted warnings, but James was already moving. With speed and precision that came from years of training, James closed the distance between them. His hand locked around Howard's wrist before the man could draw his weapon. With his other hand, James applied careful pressure to Howard's shoulder, using the man's own momentum to turn him away from the crowd. "Don't," James said quietly, close to Howard's ear. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not worth it." Howard struggled briefly, then froze as he felt something press against his side. James's own concealed weapon now drawn with his free hand, hidden from the view of onlookers by their close proximity. "You're armed?" Howard whispered, shock evident in his voice. "Licensed and legal," James confirmed softly. "Same as you. Difference is, I don't draw on unarmed people or threaten children." For a long moment they stood locked together, a tableau that onlookers could not fully understand. To the watching crowd, it looked like James had simply blocked Howard from reaching his gun. Only the two men knew that James had turned the tables completely. "Here's what's going to happen," James continued, his voice still low and calm. "I'm going to step back. You're going to keep your hands visible and walk out of this building. You're going to go home and think very carefully about the choices you've made today. And tomorrow you're going to make better ones." "Or what?" Howard managed, though his bravado was failing. Or the police will see multiple videos of you attempting to draw a weapon in a public meeting. They'll hear witness statements about you, threatening my son yesterday. They'll find out you've been impersonating security personnel without proper licensing. And you'll face charges that will end any possibility of you ever working in security again, public or private. James eased the pressure on Howard's wrist and slowly withdrew his own weapon, concealing it again before anyone could notice. He stepped back, hands now visible and empty. "Your choice," he said simply. Howard stood frozen, his face a battlefield of emotions. Rage, humiliation, fear. The watching crowd held its collective breath. Then Howard's shoulders sagged. Without another word, he turned and walked stiffly toward the exit. The room exhaled. Patricia approached James cautiously. "What did you say to him?" James shrugged. "Just that we all have choices to make. Every day we decide what kind of person we want to be." Outside, James found Diane and Tyler waiting anxiously near their car. Tyler rushed forward. "Dad, are you okay? What happened in there?" James pulled his son into a hug. "Everything's fine. Mr. Baxter and I reached an understanding." Diane's eyes searched his face, reading between the lines. "Is it over?" James looked back at the community center where neighbors were emerging, talking animatedly about what they'd witnessed. Several nodded respectfully to him as they passed. "Not quite," he said. "But it's a start." The drive home was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into their driveway, Tyler finally broke the silence. "Dad, how come you never got angry with him? Even when he said those things?" James turned off the engine and considered the question carefully. "Anger is easy, son. Control is hard. In my line of work, losing control meant people got hurt. I learned to channel that energy into focus instead." "But he deserved it," Tyler insisted. "He was wrong about everything." "Yes, he was," James agreed. "But responding with anger wouldn't have changed his mind. It would have just confirmed what he already believed." As they walked toward the house, a car slowed on the street. James tensed momentarily, but it was just Lee Chen from across the street, rolling down his window. "Hey, James. Quite a meeting." "Huh?" "Some of us are getting together next weekend for a neighborhood cookout. Would your family like to join us?" James smiled, feeling something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "We'd like that very much. Thank you." Inside their home, James locked the door and checked the security system. Habits that would take more than one day to break. But as he watched Tyler and Diane move through their evening routine, he felt a cautious optimism. They had faced a challenge and stood their ground with dignity. The neighborhood had shown its true colors, most of them good. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, they were home. And for the first time since moving to Oak Ridge Estates, it truly felt like it. A week passed quietly after the confrontation at the community center. The Wilson family settled into a new routine, one without hourly drive-bys from Howard's SUV or suspicious neighbors taking photos of their property. James still checked the security cameras each morning out of habit, but the footage showed nothing but the occasional delivery truck or neighbor walking a dog. "You seem more relaxed," Diane commented one evening as they sat on their patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. James nodded. "It feels different now, like we can breathe." Tyler mentioned that Kevin invited him to a study group on Thursday, Diane said. "And Mrs. Lee brought over a casserole yesterday while you were at work." "Progress," James said with a small smile. He didn't mention that he'd also been keeping an eye on Howard's house, which had remained quiet since the meeting. The man's car hadn't moved in days. On Saturday morning, James was trimming the hedges when a police car pulled up in front of their house. His muscles tensed instinctively, but he set down the clippers and wiped his hands on his jeans, reminding himself that this was a normal neighborhood interaction, not a threat. Two officers stepped out, a tall woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and an older man with salt and pepper hair. They approached with professionally neutral expressions. "Good morning," the woman said. "Are you James Wilson?" "Yes, ma'am." James replied. How can I help you? I'm Officer Rivera. This is Sergeant Parker. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Howard Baxter. James nodded, unsurprised. Of course. Would you like to come inside? That won't be necessary, Sergeant Parker said. We understand there was an incident at your HOA meeting last weekend. There was, James confirmed. Mr. Baxter became agitated during a discussion about neighborhood security. The board president asked for his security badge and he reacted poorly. Officer Rivera took notes. Several witnesses mentioned he may have reached for a weapon. He did, James said simply. I prevented him from drawing it. The officers exchanged glances. And how did you do that, sir? Sergeant Parker asked. I used minimal necessary force to secure his wrist and de-escalate the situation, James explained, in clear, precise terms. My military training emphasized nonviolent conflict resolution whenever possible. Your former military? Officer Rivera asked. Yes, ma'am. Special Forces retired 2 years ago. Again, the officers shared a look. Mr. Wilson, we should inform you that we arrested Howard Baxter yesterday, Sergeant Parker said. He was attempting to purchase additional firearms despite a new restraining order against him. James absorbed this information with a calm nod, though internally alarm bells were ringing. A restraining order? Filed by Patricia Green from your HOA board, Officer Rivera explained. Apparently, Mr. Baxter made some threats after losing his security position. I see, James said carefully. Is my family in any danger? We don't believe so, Sergeant Parker assured him. We've confiscated his weapons and he's currently in custody. But we wanted to inform you of the situation and get your statement about last weekend's events. They spent the next 20 minutes going through the details. James was precise and factual, mentioning Howard's confrontation with the teenagers and his behavior at the meeting, but omitting the fact that he himself had been armed. Some things were better left unsaid. As the officers were leaving, Sergeant Parker turned back. Mr. Wilson, just between us, we've had issues with Howard Baxter before. Complaints about him overstepping his authority, harassing visitors to the neighborhood. Nothing that rose to criminal charges, but, well, let's just say your community is probably safer now. James nodded his understanding. Thank you for letting me know. After the police left, James went inside to find Diane and Tyler watching from the window. What did they want? Diane asked, worry creasing her forehead. Information about Howard, James explained, keeping his tone matter-of-fact for Tyler's benefit. Apparently, he's been arrested. Good, Tyler said with unexpected firmness. He pointed a gun at me and my friends. James placed a hand on his son's shoulder. That's for the police to handle now. Our job is to move forward, to build a life here. The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. James checked the security camera on his phone. It was Lee Chen and his wife, along with several other neighbors, all carrying dishes covered in foil. Did we forget about the cookout? Diane asked, confused. James opened the door to find Lee grinning broadly. Hope we're not interrupting. We thought, why wait until next weekend? The weather's perfect today. Behind him, at least a dozen neighbors stood in the driveway. Some faces James recognized from the HOA meeting, others were new to him. All wore friendly smiles. We brought food, said an elderly woman holding up a pie. And I made my famous lemonade. No neighborhood gathering is complete without it. James looked at Diane, who seemed as surprised as he was. This is unexpected. He said. Lee's expression grew more serious. Look, after what happened at the meeting, a lot of us realized we hadn't been very welcoming. Howard might have been the worst of it, but the rest of us, well, we could have done more to make you feel at home. A middle-aged man stepped forward. My family was the first Indian family in this community back in 1995. It wasn't easy then either. But people can change. Communities can change. Diane recovered her composure first. Well, we've got plenty of space in the backyard, and I think we have some burgers in the freezer. Already covered, called a woman from the back of the group, holding up a cooler. My husband's bringing the grill. Within an hour, the Wilsons Backyard had transformed into an impromptu block party. Lawn chairs appeared, children chased each other across the grass, and the air filled with the smell of grilling meat and the sound of conversation and laughter. Tyler and his friends set up the basketball hoop at the edge of the driveway, visible from the backyard. This time, no one complained about the noise. James found himself by the grill with several neighborhood fathers discussing everything from lawn care to local sports teams. No one mentioned Howard directly, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement in the way they included James, asking his opinion and listening when he spoke. "You know," said a man named Robert who lived a few houses down, "my grandfather was military too. Korea. He always said you learn more about a person in one difficult moment than in years of easy ones." James nodded, understanding the message beneath the words. People show who they really are when things get tough. "This neighborhood showed some ugly sides recently," Robert admitted. "But I'd like to think we're showing a better side today." As evening approached, someone brought out string lights and hung them between trees. Children switched from basketball to catching fireflies in jars. Adults gathered in groups, conversations flowing as naturally as if they'd been neighbors for years instead of weeks. Patricia Green arrived late, apologizing for missing the start of the gathering. She pulled James aside briefly. "I wanted you to know that the HOA board had an emergency meeting yesterday. We've revised several outdated policies, including the security patrol guidelines. From now on, any security concerns go directly to actual law enforcement, not volunteers." "That's a positive change," James said. Patricia nodded. "We're also forming a neighborhood welcome committee. I was hoping you and Diane might consider joining. We could use your perspective." As the stars began appearing overhead, Tyler approached his father. The boy seemed different somehow, standing taller, more confident than he had been since the move. "Dad," he said quietly, "is this what you meant? About making a home here?" James looked around at their yard filled with neighbors who had become friends in the space of an afternoon. "Yes, son, this is exactly what I meant." Later, as the gathering began to wind down, Lee raised his glass in a toast. "To new friends and good neighbors, and to the Wilsons, thank you for not giving up on us." Glasses clinked and voices echoed the sentiment. James felt Diane's hand slip into his, squeezing gently. They had faced a challenge most families never would, standing their ground with dignity when threatened. In doing so, they hadn't just secured their place in the neighborhood, they had transformed it. Over the following months, Oak Ridge Estates changed in subtle but important ways. The HOA newsletter featured a monthly neighbor spotlight, highlighting the diverse backgrounds and contributions of community members. The basketball court at the end of the street was renovated and expanded, with Tyler often volunteering to help younger kids practice. Diane joined the school board, bringing her expertise in education to benefit all the community's children. As for Howard Baxter, he eventually pled guilty to several charges and was required to complete community service and anger management classes. He sold his house in Oak Ridge Estates and moved away. Few neighbors mentioned him anymore. He had become a fading memory, an example of the community's past, not its future. 1 year after moving in, James sat on his front porch, watching Tyler and his friends shoot hoops in the driveway. The sounds of their laughter mixed with the distant hum of lawnmowers and the cheerful shouts of children playing down the street, the ordinary soundtrack of suburban life. Lee walked by with his dog and waved. "Cookout at our place this weekend, don't forget." James waved back. "We'll be there." As Lee continued his walk, James leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to relax completely. His family had found more than a house here. They had found a home, a community, a place where they truly belonged. It hadn't come easily, but the most valuable things rarely did. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the basketball on concrete and his son's voice calling plays. This was what peace felt like. This was what he had fought for all those years. This was home.